Looking into the future and future plant invaders. Please welcome from Manaaki Whenua, Jennifer Bufford. Kia ora.
Kia ora, and tēnā koutou. I'm excited to talk to you today about some of the work that we've been doing, following on what Imogen said about looking into the future, thinking a little bit longer term, and thinking about how we can build proactive partnerships between researchers and managers so that we can actually do the research now that we need to answer the questions that are coming at us in the future. Now, the key problem here is, of course, well, what is the future? What's that going to look like? And so the first thing we did is look at different possible futures using a scenario building approach. We aimed for 2050, and we invited people from a diverse range of backgrounds, perspectives, and institutions to come and help us figure out what some of these scenarios might look like. Many of you are in the room. Thank you so much for all of your contributions. We had an in-person workshop, and we narrowed it down to 4 key scenarios that we wanted to explore further because they showed different directions that things might go in. And actually, following the theme of this conference, a lot of those scenarios were quite positive, which was really interesting to be able to explore. But even within these scenarios, we wanted to look at what are the opportunities and what are the risks. And we looked at that across a range of sectors, including things like the economy and biodiversity. We then took these developed scenarios to plant invasion ecologists and managers and said, well, how do you think plant invasions will change under each of these scenarios? How will the drivers of invasion change and the processes? Which species are invasive and which systems are invasible? And what management tools will we be using? And we did this through an in-person workshop with researchers and through online engagement with practitioners. We used this framework to try and look at how those drivers might be changing. So this walks through the invasion process and the different ways that a scenario might influence the invasion process. So we start with governance and policy, which together with things like historical legacies and economic effects, change how we use the land and how we manage land. And this creates a mosaic around our management unit. That mosaic affects what we call propagule pressure. So that's simply the invasive species that are arriving into a management unit. That would be things like seeds or fragments that come in. And that's driven by which species are in the landscape and how abundant they are. When we actually look at the management unit, we think about dispersal, which is the process of those seeds arriving into the management unit. And that can be driven by things like wind or birds. But once a seed arrives, it actually has to pass through biotic and abiotic filters that prevent a lot of species from being successful. So those abiotic filters would be things like climate matching, and biotic filters would be things like herbivory or competition. A subset of these species will actually be successful, and they'll establish, and some of those will need to be managed for their impacts. So using this framework, we then applied it to each of our scenarios and asked, how will invasions change, and what are some of the research priorities and management needs under each of these scenarios? So the first scenario, we said, well, by 2050, what if we have a really significant increase in Maori land tenure, so that the majority of land in Aotearoa is managed by Maori communities, and Maori communities are really well represented in decision making. Under this scenario, one of the key opportunities is that management would emphasize ecosystem services and cultural uses in Mātauranga and native biodiversity. But one of the key risks is that these kinds of transitions are always challenging. So maintaining control of invasive plants and maintaining capacity across the transition can be a risk. This scenario is going to really highlight a range of perspectives on what's a weed and what's acceptable control for a weed. And that's both within Maori communities and between Maori and non-Maori land managers. And this will create a complex land management mosaic where different people are making different decisions. That will influence that propagule pressure, the species that are around and can come in as invaders. And it also affects national or regional targets like eradication programs or something like wild and conifer control. So the research and management priorities here are really around developing effective bicultural approaches so that we can build consensus and work across differing perspectives and values. The second scenario, we said, well, what if we as a country, Aotearoa, we decide that we're no longer going to use non-native exotic plant species for production, forestry, and ecosystem services. Instead, we're replacing them all with native species, and we're also planting marginal areas and riparian areas with native forests for ecosystem services and biodiversity credits. The key risk here obviously is going to be economic disruption because we do rely so much on non-native trees for production at the moment. But the benefits include a reduction in that invasive propagule pressure. So if we really remove all of those exotic trees, we have fewer invaders or potential invaders on the landscape. We're also going to see a huge increase in connectivity of native forest, and that can really benefit our native birds and other animals. It can also benefit our native plants by building up their population sizes and allowing gene flow. But increased connectivity will also benefit pathogens, and it will also benefit things like possums. So there will be a downside here. And a lot of the research priorities are around understanding how that connectivity works and what the net effects will be, and around building, how do we build resilient plantings? And that's a key management priority here as well, so that we can build and establish plantings that don't require continual invasive plant control. The third scenario I don't have to say much about to this crowd. It's predator-free 2050. We said if this is successful, what does it mean for plant invasions? One of the key risks is that there's decreased focus and funding for invasive plant control in the lead up to 2050. And that could mean that we have a backlog of weed work that needs done and greater propagule pressure across the landscape. Of course, the biggest change is going to be that we're taking some species out of these complex biotic networks, and understanding the impacts of that is going to take quite a bit of research effort. We're going to see major changes in seed predation. We're also going to see huge changes in dispersal with the increase in birds. That will benefit a lot of our native plants, but it will benefit some of our non-native plants too. And so understanding which species are likely to benefit so that we can control them ahead of time can be really effective for invasive plant control. So the priority here, both in research and management, is understanding these complex outcomes in these network manipulations and which species ultimately will benefit. The fourth and final scenario we looked at is one that unfortunately we're already seeing, but this is an increased frequency, scale, and intensity of fires, storms, and floods. Under this scenario, the key risks are that we see funds diverted away from conservation and towards things like emergency responses and infrastructure repair. There's also going to be just a physical disruption of invasive species control because sites become inaccessible, control methods don't work anymore, or because personnel are redirected. And this could result in an increase in propagule pressure from those uncontrolled invasions, and that change in those abiotic filters. So a change in the kind of conditions that may promote non-native species that thrive under disturbance. Under this scenario, some of the research and management priorities are in building flexibility and redundancy into our management tools so that we can deal with the uncertainty and these events as they come, and also in understanding better which species are going to benefit from that disturbance and what the effect of multiple recurring disturbances is, because that's a situation we're seeing more and more. There were also a number of needs that came up across the scenarios. So every time we talked with managers and researchers, there were certain themes that just kept coming up. And we talk about these as sure bets, consistent needs. No matter what the future scenario looks like, these are probably going to be really helpful. And these won't be a surprise if you've been listening to talks, you've read the PCE report. These are themes that come up a lot. But we need better data. We need better data on species distributions, both now and in the future. And we need better data on which species are likely to be problematic in the future. We also just need better data on how that landscape mosaic affects what's happening in a particular management unit. We need better tools for early and remote detection. We need more control options, and we need better tools to assess the costs and benefits of weed control. And we need better communication. We need better communication around consensus building, particularly as we see these diverse perspectives across our landscape. And we need better communication around the importance of long-term funding so that we can secure funding that actually sees projects to completion. So what's next? Well, the scenarios and the methods will be made publicly available. And we hope that they'll be useful in stimulating long-term thinking and planning and supporting new research trajectories, not just in invasive plant ecology, but in conservation generally. We've really put a lot of effort into developing these scenarios, exploring a lot of indirect and complex effects, and I hope that they'll be really useful for people who want to start thinking about what the future might look like. So if you're interested, there's the handout at the back, but feel free to talk to me or Angela and Dwayne, who have been involved in this. Thanks again for all of you who are involved in both the workshops, and look forward to talking to you. Thank you.
Tēnā koe Jennifer, ka rawe hoki.